primary aspect of my job is contextualizing the risk.
Right.
Why does it matter? What then, because what can you do about it is one thing, but it also is, why does it matter? How is it going to affect us? So I think as well for stakeholders and for people that are kind of a bit more in control of the policies and actually implementation, it's helping them understand why they need to care and then what to do about it.
You're listening to the ISF podcast for your organization's better cybersecurity. Your host, ISF CEO Steve Durbin, is an expert in leadership, business culture transformation, and cyber strategies for today's top enterprises. I'm producer Tavia Gilbert. Today, Steve speaks with Kailyn Johnson, cyber intelligence and geopolitical risk lead at UK consulting firm Sibylline. Kailyn and Steve discuss the current threat landscape, focusing on areas where cyber and geopolitics overlap, and she offers some practical advice on how to contextualize security for your organization's C-suite.
Kailyn, lovely to see you. Thanks so much for coming across to the studio today.
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be here.
Now, you're a risk analyst, so tell us a bit about your career in cyber. How did you get started? What sort of attracted you to the space?
Great question. So initially did my master's degree in security and intelligence. So a very much international relations sort of role. Mm-hmm. And then within that, we had to specialize. And it was shortly after the WannaCry NotPetya attacks that occurred in 2017 is when we had to choose a specialization. So I decided to specialize in cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. And then finishing my degree, got a role as a CTI analyst at a threat intelligence platform. Doing primarily like strategic intelligence and kind of a bit more trend analysis, being the layman's person to kind of navigate what the malware analysts were producing and kind of their very technical reports, trying to kind of take away what people who are not technical needed to know and then what to do with that, how to action it. Mm-hmm. So from there, then I moved into a more of a managed like MSSP work, still CTI consulting, but still from a more perspective of, alert triaging, also investigations, still that's like being intelligence led. It was always primarily though looking at, risks, what's happening, how is that going to affect us, what does that then mean for us as a business and whatever sort of area they were looking at. And then with Sibylline, it's always been a company that I've always had my eye on. Right. Being a primarily political risk strategic consultancy, when I was doing my degree, that was always an organization that was of interest, just the geopolitical risk field in general, and having that kind of cyber element was a good mesh between the two, especially since the last few years we've kind of noticed there needs to be the convergence of cyber risk and geopolitical risk and kind of looking at the bigger picture, why these things are happening and how they're happening together and influencing each other. And I think as well, just with looking at risk, it's a really fascinating section of the industry to be in because it's more of why do we need to know about this and then what do we do with it? What are the impacts? What are the implications? That I think a lot of times we look at what's happening, what does that mean? But we're not necessarily looking at, okay, what do we do with this now? How do we then action it? What does that then mean for us in the short, medium, long term? And I think that's a really cool position to be in now, especially at Sibylline, kind of connecting the convergence of geopolitical risk and cyber risk.
And what are some of those top risks? Because, we're coming towards the end of the year. I know this podcast will probably go out and people will listen to it into 2025, but it's a sort of time of year when everybody starts to come out with their predictions about, what we should be worried about in 2025 and that kind of thing. What are some of the key risks that you see?
I think it'll be a lot of the same that we saw in 2024. So, ransomware remaining kind of a key risk, especially now that there's been an increase in seizures of major ransomware programs by law enforcement. We're seeing then smaller ransomware as a service programs emerging following the takedowns of some of these major groups, whether this is, the people who are part of those programs kind of taking some of the source code away from it, or just the fact that the dark web is now becoming a lot more democratized. So there's a lot more accessibility for these sorts of things, a lot smaller operations. That means there's a lot more for people to kind of purchase and utilize. So we're kind of seeing just ransomware continuing to be a consistent risk to business operations, financial risk, reputational risk, security risks, operational risks. But alongside that, we're also then seeing kind of the influx of a lot more low-skilled threat actors having now the capabilities to conduct sophisticated operations with the democratization of the dark web. So it's kind of this double-edged sort of, ransomware is being taken down, but it's like a hydra. You cut off one head, 3 more emerge. And then now that the dark web is a lot more accessible for people, a lot more actors now have the ability to just spend a bit of money, and they don't actually have to know how to code. They don't know how to execute some of these tools. Now with a lot of AI tools and open source AI tools being accessible and just kind of ready to go, threat actors can now conduct a variety of operations. So it's expanding the risk landscape for a lot of businesses, not just from organized cyber criminals and state-sponsored actors, but also from the hacktivists, from unorganized and kind of low sophisticated actors as well. Those are kind of two ones that work in tandem together, but also are their own risks. And then along with that, as I mentioned, state-sponsored actors. The geopolitical landscape, especially coming into 2025, is going to be a tumultuous year. And I mean, we talk about uncertainty, and it is going to be uncertain. I mean, we've been working in uncertain times for years. So that is a lot of the same, but it's just kind of the geopolitical impact of particularly like a Trump presidency on how that's going to impact relationships with, Iran, with Israel, with China, with Russia. And that then also has implications to then what is going to happen in the cyberspace when it comes to espionage, when it comes to, information theft, primarily for like intellectual property, when it comes to competition and, the potential economic sanctions that are going to be potentially placed on not only China, but on all foreign exports and imports actually into the US, and how that then affects geopolitical relationships even with allies. So I think that is also a key risk of how the geopolitical risk landscape is going to influence the cyber risk landscape.
Right. And what are the sorts of things that you think that organizations can do to prepare for some of the things you've just been talking about? Because, ransomware is pretty well understood. People hopefully will have got their processes in place to deal with that. They'll have had the discussions, with the board about how they're going to respond. They'll have the plans in place, you would hope. But some of the other things you've just touched on, very different. We've not seen that before. What are the sorts of things that organizations can do to prepare?
I think with this, it's having a conversation, especially within organizations, between their physical security teams and their GSOCs, their global security operation centers, and their cybersecurity teams, whether that's their network security, their CTIs and SOC teams. It's having that relationship primarily that I think is hugely important to understand what's happening from a physical security level, whether this is, related to geopolitics, whether it's related to protests, unrest, crime, even natural disasters and things like that, and how that then affects the cybersecurity landscape for the same business, and kind of what that means of having the bigger picture of these teams need to work together. But within that as well, it's forcing a lot more businesses to be agile, because especially in major organizations, the bureaucratic red tape sometimes creates such massive processes that it halts being able to be agile and to address the risk landscape as it comes. So with that, it's having kind of the ability to be dynamic in how we address, security risks, and when we see them, what can we immediately remediate and how can we implement certain things, and then what are maybe more policies that kind of can be down the line. But within that, I think it's also just prioritizing cybersecurity and geopolitics in general and understanding how the two connect. And the fact is, though, as well, a lot of these things have precedent already. So we kind of can use the trends that have been ongoing in the past to help influence and kind of inform policies and procedures to help navigate the uncertainty in the future. So when it comes to, geopolitical risk, like what a Trump presidency looked like previously and how that affected, particularly like cyber risk for businesses when they're in certain locations. So like if they're in China, if they're in Asia Pacific, if they're based in Africa, what are kind of the cyber risks that are associated with some of the policies that are being implemented? We've already seen that previously, so then we can kind of utilize that to at least help inform where we might need to at least create a baseline to then try to then be able to navigate the uncertainties, and when things that were unknowns hit, at least we then have a baseline of things that primarily probably have at least a bit of a precedent.
And what are some of the key things that you would like organizations to be doing to deal with some of the things, again, that you've just been touching on here? How can they prepare, basically?
Of course. I think a big one is just being open to change Especially when it comes to cyber risk, it's a lot of times, do we have the budget? What is the budget going to prioritize? Are we focusing the budget on the right things? I think having a bit flexibility in what we prioritize, especially like for security entities within an organization, they kind of have firsthand knowledge. So being able to have that conversation maybe with more stakeholders that are, controlling the budget, kind of having that dialogue so you can kind of see what are the stakeholders needing to prioritize versus what the teams that are dealing with these risks at hand are seeing, and where they can like try to at least maybe find a compromise of, hey, we need to robust these security detections, which might then mean utilizing a new service, or maybe we hire a few more people so we've got a bit more round the clock visibility. But then how do we then kind of compromise that for the top down of, you've got a certain amount of budget, so what's kind of then the relationship between that? As well as I think with this, for businesses to try to navigate, it's also just having kind of, I think, an understanding of what they need to do for their own customers, but also then what they can do themselves before things happen. So as you said, ransomware, there should be hopefully policies in place, remediations in place.
Yeah.
How do you address vulnerabilities that, have patches released but actually haven't been implemented, which you're then leaving yourselves vulnerable? I think it's also fixing the things that need to be fixed and making sure that they are fixed and making sure that that's a priority. It sometimes falls a bit through the gaps because it affects operations. It might, have a bit of downtime. It might cause a bit of financial distress temporarily, have a bit of losses, but in the long term, it's worth it. So I think from that, there's a lot of organizational kind of changes that sometimes need to be made, but then it's always about a compromise. But then there's also ways to reduce the risk that is there. And when you can reduce the unnecessary risk, you should. Sometimes, a bit of short-term uncomfortability and short-term operational downtime is worth it, because in the long run, the financial losses, the long-term operational losses, the reputational damage that you can kind of get from subsequent, cyber attacks that you could have actually addressed are more impactful.
It's a difficult one to balance, though, isn't it? This sort of short-term downtime, as you mentioned, for longer-term gain. And I know that a lot of security teams struggle with that one, to get the message across.
Yeah.
Anything that you've seen that people listening to this could pick up on as a sort of a tip, if you like, as to how to balance those things out? I mean, I always tell them to try to align it much more with where the business is going.
Yeah.
So make it come alive, help the business understand some of the implications of what we're talking about. But anything else that you've seen that works?
I think you touch on a really good point, and a primary aspect of my job is contextualizing the risk.
Right.
Why does it matter? What then, because what can you do about it is one thing, but it also is, why does it matter? How is it going to affect us? So I think as well, for stakeholders and for people that are kind of a bit more in control of the policies and actually implementation, it's helping them understand why they need to care and then what to do about it. And, you can't tell someone, oh, this is exactly what you need to do, but it's like, here, we've got to patch these systems that are vulnerable, because if we don't, it'll have XYZ impact on our business in the short, medium, long term. And sometimes even then quantifying that sort of information. So, how much in financial loss, how much in downtime would that affect? Like being able to then have the numbers or the quantifiable data along with the contextual, more qualitative information, I think helps more stakeholders and people higher in the business make informed decisions and actually understand what you're saying, and then understand the actual impact of how that affects them. Because you can give them jargon all you want, but if they don't understand it in a way that is meaningful to them, they're not going to do anything about it.
No, and the same applies to budget, of course, doesn't it?
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
It's exactly the same. I mean, I have to say I get quite irritated when people tell me they haven't got enough money, because what it says to me is that they're not doing a good enough job. I mean, some of my members will obviously hate me saying this, but they're not doing a good enough job about really contextualizing the implications of not doing something versus doing it. So again, other than some of the things you've just talked about, anything that you've seen or could recommend in terms of how to unlock some of that budget that perhaps might not be immediately available, shall we say?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's just having that dialogue and like having these relationships with the people who hold the budget, I think is really important, and also kind of showing off the value that these teams have to the people with budget sometimes might help unlock a bit of that budget. It's like if you're seeing kind of the benefit of those teams, you're more likely to give them the budget that they might need for it. And, you know, whether that's internally or sometimes externally, like if you've produced really good work or if you've created all these detections that have helped improve the network security for your organization, how could we maybe publish that, whether it's internally to, you know, the stakeholders or if it's for everyone, so people are seeing actually they're doing a really good job. And then within that, we feel a bit more trustworthy of these teams, of these organizations, that then we're going to, you know, buy their services or we're going to rely on them internally to help us when, you know, we might need something from a different department, and having then those kind of organizational and the collaboration as well. So I think it's kind of also showing your worth and to the people who need to be kind of proven too. It's a bit annoying because it's like we shouldn't have to prove our worth. Like we're obviously doing a good job, and sometimes, especially within cybersecurity, no news is good news.
Right.
Like if nothing happens, that is a good thing, and it's a difficult thing to maintain. There's always something happening. So if you're not hearing anything about some major incident happening on your cyber teams, they're doing a good job. And I think sometimes that's also forgotten, that no news is good news. So then maybe trying to show that in a positive way of, you know, we've protected against these amount of risks or like these threats that then we've got tangible data for, we're able to protect against these, or we noticed that, you know, this is the threat landscape right now based off of what's happening kind of with the, you know, ransomware trends or cyber criminal trends, and state-sponsored actors are, you know, maybe targeting us. So we've created new security detections, and it's actually helped combat some of these things, or we were able to detect intrusions a lot quicker. So you're kind of then showing we haven't had anything major, which is great, but this is how we haven't had anything major. And maybe that's also then kind of ability to kind of prove your worth a wee bit. Which is annoying that you kind of have to, but it then might help then unlock that budget a wee bit and get that visibility that some of these teams don't necessarily always get unless something really wrong happens. And that's not what you want.
No, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I like to see is benchmarking. You know, I like to understand how my spend, how my defences stack up against other organisations in a similar space or of a similar size, and that kind of thing. One of the questions I frequently ask is, you know, am I spending the right amount? I'm always sort of leaning towards maybe I'm spending too much. So, but how does that, you know, stack up against what everybody else is doing? So there are those sorts of things as well, I think, that teams can bring about. Now, you mentioned geopolitics, and you mentioned, you know, the expanding number of threats that we're going to be seeing and so on. Whenever I talk about geopolitics, it inevitably leads to a discussion around the role of government, the role of regulation. Any views on those two topics?
With government and regulations, especially when it comes to like cybersecurity and technology, it's always a bit behind. I mean, government, when it comes to, you know, policies at a national level, it always is going to be a bit slower because there's a lot more to navigate and a lot more processes you have to go to be able to get regulations ahead. Within that, I think as well, though, some regulations are good to have, and businesses need to be aware of them, especially when it comes to like GDPR, data protections. Now, especially within the EU, there's DORA and kind of the impacts that might have on a business. But sometimes I think it's almost a worry of like, are we in compliance? Are we adhering to the regulations? And it's usually you are, but it's sometimes almost you're so focused on the impact of the regulations that you sometimes then forget, wait, actually the processes that we're doing are working. Then should we just maybe let things kind of play out and see how they're going? I think there's always a bit of a worry of, are we always in compliance? And it's good that we have that worry, but it's also sometimes of a case of just keep doing what you're doing, and you've got your compliance teams to tell you when you're not. And with regulations, this is what you've got the teams that are able to kind of, you know, be informed with its legal and compliance. They'll help you then be able to inform practices to help your business make sure you're on top of regulations. But it shouldn't be the only worry a business has. And if you're so worried about adhering to the regulations, a lot of things then fall behind. That it's kind of a balancing act of how do we balance maintaining regulations and being compliant, but also how do we maintain doing what we need to do to protect the business and to protect our customers and whatever we're doing, and especially when it comes to government. They have a huge role in both public and private sector operations. So whether that's a case of how they operate, within other public entities, how they operate then as well in like the relationships within the private sector, there's a bit more confusion on kind of like how we can interact together as well between the public and private sector. And a lot of times the public sector is using a lot of private sector vendors and a lot of private sector like operations and, processes and softwares that I think there's a lot of like, how do we integrate these when it's already in practice? And it's more of just strengthening the relationship of how we can utilize the government and how the government can utilize us to kind of enhance security on a more rounded, holistic level, I guess. I don't know if that really answers your question, but
I think it does. I mean, I think for me, I always raise an eyebrow when people talk to me about their compliance because good compliance doesn't necessarily equal good security, and it is this sort of balancing act. And I think if you're working in an organisation that is very compliance focused, then the role of security is a little bit more complicated because you've got to navigate some of that. And to the point you're making earlier, perhaps you didn't use the word justify, but justify your existence, justify the budget, particularly if you're in the fortunate position of not having had a breach, not having had downtime, because people do tend to forget, don't they, what the impact of some of those things might actually be. And so it is, as I say, a final sort of balancing act that people have to go through there. In the work that you've done in terms of assessing some of these risks and so on, is there anything that sticks out for you, the characteristics I'm looking for of the good organisation versus the not so good?
that it's hard to like qualify because there's no right answer for either. And I think it's also specific to an organization on what good security means for them, but especially when it's based off of what their threat landscape looks like and where they operate, how large the company is. And there's a lot more that goes into it. And then just like it's not one size fits all. So what looks like a good organization maybe at a global entity that has thousands of personnel all over the world versus a team of 10, a small startup, it's going to look different on how good security looks for them. So I don't think we can necessarily place it in such a dichotomy because it never is anyways. Your organization might have good security and be a good organization in certain aspects, but also might be lacking in certain other aspects, whereas another entity might from the outside look really bad, but actually they've got good security. It's just, and like good processes, it's just from the outside it doesn't seem like that, but it's working and they're secure and it's maintaining what it needs to maintain. It's hard to have a one-size-fits-all or, this is good, this is bad. It's going to be variable for every entity, and even for every entity in every location that they operate, in every part of the business, it's always going to be slightly different and slightly varied. So it's hard to have that one-size-fits-all kind of perspective.
So looking forward again into 2025, over the coming 12 months, if there were three things that you would like to see organisations do better, what might they be? Apply
patches.
So basics,
Like software vulnerabilities is a massive trend that I've seen throughout my career, the last 6-7 years. And it's a constant vector for threat actors to gain access, to move laterally, to execute code that a lot of times are easy fixes. Patches for a lot of these are readily available. 0 days are constantly being discovered, and there is an influx of a lot more threat actors utilizing 0 days. So you can't protect against what you don't know and what you don't even know exists. But when we have protections available for vulnerabilities that we know exist and are there, apply them.
Right.
I know it's really difficult sometimes for organizations to do that, especially within healthcare, because legacy systems that either no longer are updated or no longer are maintained at all, but because they've got to utilize, certain technologies like MRIs or, X-rays that are a bit more outdated, and to be able to actually utilize those and still operate, you're going to have to, maybe run Windows XP. But for the systems that can be updated, they should be updated. And I know operational downtime is a big thing. It's like there should be a process to do it in segmentations to it where it doesn't actually disrupt any operations and it's not going to have any negative life-threatening consequences or negative, operational consequences or security consequences even to apply these. But I think it's just having better patch management policies is a major one that I think will help businesses at least kind of be able to address the risks that they know about. It's not one size fits all, but just apply the patches when they're there would help at least mitigate some of the risk that businesses face. That would be one. I would say another one would be better understanding the software supply chain for organizations and what vendors that they use, but also then the relationship between vendors and their customers. And having, we always talk about zero trust policies.
Yeah.
It's still a bit, I think, in my opinion, lacking in execution. And especially for, large organizations, you're working with a variety of vendors and third parties, whether it's from HR, payroll, your the software that you're using, Microsoft, are you using Linux, like Apple? It's so complex within organizations, their like supply chain, but better understanding the supply chain risks and how to maybe secure their supply chain a bit more, I think would help at least better understand the threat landscape that comes from the supply chain and how to then maybe mitigate some of that risk, whether it is having, zero trust policies where they're kind of completely segmented and you only get, certain visibility and certain access when you need it, and then it's immediately removed. I think that's a big one. And a lot of threat actors are exploiting the software supply chain, whether that's via software vulnerabilities or just exploiting that those trusted relationships to either target anyone and everyone or to move laterally into strategic clients for certain organizations. So I think supply chain, better understanding your supply chain, especially when it comes to software supply chain, and just then understanding the risks associated with supply chain is another one that I think is a key risk, just to kind of keep monitoring. And then the final one I would say is the critical national infrastructure being a major target and kind of the implications that has for businesses, whether that is direct implications, whether it's second order impact, even third order impact, kind of how the increase of threat actors targeting critical national infrastructure. So whether this is telecommunications, whether it's healthcare, banking, government, how that then affects businesses, whether it's directly or indirectly, especially when it comes to their relationships with some of those entities, I think will help businesses maybe navigate then their own risks as well and be able to understand that landscape as well. But yeah, the increase in critical national infrastructure being a key target for not only state-sponsored operations, but also hacktivists and cybercriminal operations just means it's a lot more complex, and that now we've got a lot more threat actors who are capable. It's widened the landscape significantly, that then it means that there is a lot more risk associated with these industries. And so it's also like now we have to focus on prioritizing these sectors, on prioritizing security, but also just on understanding why they're being targeted, the different motivations for different threat actors, the different tactics that they're utilizing. I think will then help not only secure critical infrastructure, but also help secure the second and third parties that also are reliant on critical national infrastructure and have a relationship with critical national infrastructure.
So some of the basics there that you mentioned, the patching, but also some of the more, what I would call interesting elements of it, where you've got to really start collaborating and think a bit more about what you're doing. Kailyn, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. We've run out of time. We could have gone on for very much longer.
I could talk for ages, so this is probably for the best.
But thank you very much indeed for sharing some of those insights. I'm sure our listeners will have found it really valuable. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Our thanks to this week's guest, Kailyn Johnson. We'll be back with another new episode soon. In the meantime, if you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and we'd be pleased if you'd consider sharing the episode. To become a member, get in touch with Steve directly at steve.durbin@securityforum.org or on LinkedIn. Check out all our media and resources. All of it is there to support you at securityforum.org. Don't miss our other podcast, Dear InfoSec, sharing conversations with members about the real-world applications of ISF research. The ISF podcast is produced by TalkBox Productions and Tavia Gilbert. Thanks for listening.